A human body, unclothed, has almost no fur left. No thick coat, no undercoat, nothing built into the skin to trap warm air, the way a wolf or a mammoth has. And yet humans lived through genuine Ice Age winters, in open country, in temperatures that would kill an unprotected person in a few hours. For a large part of that history, they weren't doing it with a reliable, controlled fire, the way we imagine a campfire today. Fire use in early human history was inconsistent, hard to maintain, and not always available on demand. So the real question isn't just, how did ancient humans stay warm? It's how a nearly hairless, heat-loving primate managed to survive brutal cold, using a body that was never built for it. The answer isn't one clever trick. It's a stack of separate strategies, each one solving a different part of the same physics problem. A warm body constantly loses heat to a colder environment, and every method humans used was really just a different way of slowing that loss down, rather than replacing it with a new heat source. Start with the body itself, because it isn't defenseless. When skin temperature drops, blood vessels near the surface narrow. This is vasoconstriction, and its job is simple. Keep warm blood away from the skin, where it would just radiate heat into the air, and keep it circulating around the organs that actually need to stay warm to function. It's why cold hands and feet happen before a dangerously cold core. The body is making a trade, sacrificing the extremities, comfort to protect what matters most. If that isn't enough, muscles start contracting rapidly and involuntarily. Shivering isn't a symptom of being cold. It's the body actively generating heat, burning fuel to create warmth the environment refuses to provide. It works, but it's expensive. Shivering demands energy, and energy in a cold, food-scarce landscape was never guaranteed. A body can't shiver indefinitely without eventually running short on the calories that shivering itself is burning through. There's a third mechanism that gets less attention, because it's less visible: brown fat. Unlike the fat that mostly stores energy, brown fat's job is to burn energy directly for heat, without needing muscle movement at all. Infants have a lot of it, likely because they can't shiver effectively yet. Adults retain some, particularly people who are regularly exposed to cold, and there's reasonable evidence that populations living in colder climates for generations show adaptations tied to this kind of heat production. It's a quiet furnace running in the background, not something a person controls consciously, but part of why some bodies cope with cold more efficiently than others. None of this changes the basic problem, though. Vasoconstriction, shivering, and brown fat can buy time and reduce the rate of heat loss, but they cannot indefinitely keep a bare human warm in freezing wind. The body's internal defenses were never going to be enough on their own. Everything else ancient humans did was built to support what the body could already do, not replace it. This is where clothing becomes less about decoration and more about engineering. The critical detail isn't that ancient humans wore animal skins. It's how those skins were used. A draped hide, thrown loosely over the shoulders, does something, but it leaves gaps where warm air escapes and cold air gets in. A fitted garment, sewn to follow the shape of the body, does something very different. It creates a thin layer of trapped air between skin and material. That air, once warmed by the body, becomes a barrier the cold has to fight through before it reaches skin at all. This is why the invention of the bone needle and the ability to actually sew fitted clothing, rather than just wrap loose skins, mattered as much as any single behavioral trick. Fitted clothing traps dead air far more effectively than loose covering, and dead air is one of the best insulators available because still air barely moves heat at all compared to moving air. A tightly sewn hood, sleeves, and leggings weren't fashion choices. They were the difference between a survivable winter and a fatal one, because they stopped the constant leak of warm air that loose clothing allows. Layering worked the same way, for the same reason. Multiple thinner layers, each holding a pocket of warmed air, insulate better than a single thick layer, because each boundary between layers is another barrier the cold has to cross. This is a detail modern outdoor gear still relies on, and it wasn't obvious. It had to be discovered, refined, and passed on. Shelter followed the same underlying logic, and this is where a common assumption breaks down. The goal of early shelter wasn't to warm up a space. It was to shrink the space that needed warming in the first place, and to stop heat escaping into the ground. Heat loss to the ground is often underestimated, because people don't feel cold ground the way they feel cold wind. But a body in contact with cold earth or stone loses heat continuously through direct contact, a process far more efficient at pulling heat away than air ever is. This is why early shelters so consistently included some kind of ground layer, packed grass, moss, bark, hides, anything that put distance and insulation between a sleeping body and the cold mass underneath it. Without that layer, the ground can undo almost everything clothing accomplishes. Above the body, structures didn't need to be large or elaborate to work. A small, low, tightly enclosed space, whether a shallow pit, a hide-covered frame, or the mouth of a cave partially blocked with brush, does something a large, open shelter cannot. It limits how much air volume the body's own heat has to fight to warm. Trap a small pocket of air around a person, insulate the ground beneath them, and block moving wind, and that person's own body heat starts doing real work, warming a manageable microclimate instead of dissipating into open air. Group behavior extended the same principle further. Several bodies sleeping close together reduce the amount of exposed surface area each individual has facing the cold air, because bodies pressed against each other are, in effect, sharing warmth and blocking wind from each other. It's a crude but effective version of the same insulation logic, applied to people instead of materials. This is likely part of why early human groups often slept in close physical proximity rather than spread out, not purely for social reasons, but because it directly improved everyone's odds against the cold. Behavior mattered even in smaller, less obvious ways. Physical activity generates heat as a byproduct, so moving during the coldest parts of the day and resting in a sheltered, insulated spot during the worst exposure wasn't accidental. Posture mattered too. Curling the body inward, knees toward the chest, reduces the total surface area exposed to cold air, the same geometric principle that makes a small, compact shape lose heat more slowly than a spread-out one. None of this required understanding physics. It only required noticing, generation after generation, which choices left people less cold and repeating them. Diet played its own quiet role. Cold environments increase the body's caloric demands, both because shivering burns fuel and because maintaining core temperature in general takes more energy when the surrounding air is constantly pulling heat away. Diets higher in fat provided a denser energy source for that demand, and stored body fat itself functions as a layer of insulation, slowing heat loss the way any additional layer would. A leaner body in a cold climate faces two problems at once: less fuel reserve and less built-in insulation. Put all of this together, and a picture emerges that looks very different from the usual assumption that fire is what made cold survivable. Fire, when reliably available, was extremely useful, especially for drying clothing, treating hides, and warming a resting space directly. But for much of the time humans lived in cold climates, especially earlier populations without dependable fire-starting methods, survival depended on a completely different strategy: minimize heat loss rather than generate new heat. Fitted clothing that trapped warm air, ground insulation that stopped heat draining into the earth, small enclosed shelters that limited how much space needed warming at all, group proximity that reduced individual exposure, behavioral timing that worked with the body's own heat production instead of against it, diet that supplied the fuel. All of this required. None of these were dramatic solutions. None of them involved a single clever invention that solved the whole problem. What made cold survivable wasn't a device. It was an accumulation of small, compounding decisions about insulation, contact, air movement, and body positioning, refined and passed down, because the alternative was dying slowly and quietly overnight. That's really the answer to the original puzzle. A hairless, tropical origin body didn't need to become something else to survive an ice age. It needed help holding on to the heat it was already making, and it got that help from clothing that trapped air. Instead of just covering skin, shelter that shrank the problem. Instead of trying to heat an open space, and other bodies close enough to share the work. Fire, when it came, made all of this easier. It didn't make it possible in the first place.